near the junction of Queen and Regent Streets, in the town of Niagara-on-the-Lake, Ontario, is a charming English-style tavern called the Olde Angel Inn. Initially named the Harmonious Coach House, this historic establishment has served locals and travelers alike since its construction in 1789. Visitors to the Olde Angel Inn will find an interesting piece of Canadian history printed on the pub menu, a journal written by an American militiaman in 1813, when Niagara-on-the-Lake was a small town known as Newark, and the United States and British Canada were embroiled in the bitter War of 1812. The menu explains that the nameless soldier was a member of the New York Militia, whose journal excerpts were discovered in the archives of the Olde Angel Inn. In order to understand the contents of his journal, some historical context is required. The War of 1812 began in the midst of the Napoleonic Wars, in the aftermath of the French Emperor's disastrous invasion of Russia. Since its entry into that conflict in 1803, the British Royal Navy had accosted American merchant ships on the Atlantic and impressed any British-born deserters they found aboard into service, a practice which many Americans regarded as an insult to their national honor. In 1807, in response to Napoleon's trade embargo on Great Britain, King George III's Privy Council decreed that all American merchant ships bound for Europe must make their first stop in English ports so that they could be searched for military supplies which might find their way into French hands, another perceived affront to American sovereignty. A third act of British aggression against the United States was its peaceful overtures to Tecumseh's Confederacy, an unlikely alliance of Algonquin, Iroquoian, and Siouan nations in the Great Lakes region, which hoped to carve a sovereign pan-Indian nation from American territory. Incensed by these indignities, a handful of belligerent young American congressmen, known as war hawks, convinced their peers to declare war on Great Britain, an action which might allow their fledgling nation to achieve its long-held objective of annexing Canada. Thus, on June 18th of that fateful year, the War of 1812 began. The Americans' first martial action was to move troops and equipment to Fort Detroit in preparation for an invasion of the British province of Upper Canada, which encompasses much of the present province of Ontario. Hoping to thwart the invasion before it took place, a daring British commander, Major General Isaac Brock, made an alliance with the great Shawnee chief, Tecumseh, leader of the aforementioned Indian Confederacy, who had been at war with the United States Army for over a year. Through the use of false intelligence and illusory tactics, Brock and Tecumseh deceived the much larger American force at Fort Detroit into believing that they were a far more innumerable and formidable fighting force than reality decreed. On August 16, 1812, after enduring a brief artillery bombardment administered by the Redcoat besiegers, U.S. Brigadier General William Hull surrendered Fort Detroit to the British, eager to avert what he feared would be an Indian massacre. This stunning victory earned Brock a knighthood and the moniker Hero of Canada. Undaunted by this early defeat, the Americans mustered troops on the western shores of the Niagara River in preparation for a second invasion of Canada. Having received intelligence of this impending attack, Sir Isaac Brock relocated from the town of Amherstburg, near the junction of Lake Erie and the Detroit River, to Fort George, a palisaded military complex located at the mouth of the Niagara River. Just east of this installation was the town of Newark, formerly the capital of Upper Canada, and presently Niagara-on-the-Lake. Brock was no stranger to Fort George, having made his first visit there in 1804 as a lieutenant colonel for the purpose of quelling a mutinous conspiracy. In the early morning hours of October 13, 1812, Isaac Brock awoke in his quarters at Fort George to the thunder of distant cannons rolling in from the south. He slipped on his field uniform, supplementing it with the red sash that Tecumseh had gifted him as a token of friendship, and ordered a detachment to investigate the commotion. Not content to wait for the detachment's report, the general mounted his horse and rode south to assess the situation himself. Legend has it that, before his departure, Brock made a quick visit to Captain Powell's house in order to see his beloved Sophia. While he sat in the saddle, his betrothed served him a stirrup cup of tea and bid him a fond farewell, swearing him to return to her once the business of the day was complete. Without further ado, the general galloped off towards the sounds of battle. Brock quickly learned that an American army nearly 3 times the size of his 1,300-man Canadian Defence Force, was making its way across the Niagara River in rowboats. The British artillery battery atop Queenston Heights, a strategically important escarpment which overlooked the river, had rained a withering barrage upon the Yankee invaders, inflicting serious casualties. Despite this stiff resistance, the first wave of US troops had reached the western shore, and by way of a precarious cliffside trail, managed to capture the heights. Brock sent word to Fort George for as many reinforcements as could be spared. Rather than wait for fresh troops to arrive, the Major General, whose military career had hitherto been distinguished by a penchant for swift and stunning aggression, decided to retake Queenston Heights immediately. The commander dismounted, drew his saber, and led 2 companies of militia and British regulars in an impromptu charge uphill. Standing 6'4" and bedecked in all his martial finery, Brock struck a dashing figure as he pressed the attack at the head of his troops. He also presented a large and gaudy target to the American infantrymen who had ensconced themselves behind trees and spiked cannons on the hill above, their muskets primed and cocked. During the ascent, one US sharpshooter stepped out from behind cover and fired a double ball into Brock's chest. The celebrated hero of Canada died almost instantly. The initial British attempt to regain Queenston Heights was repulsed by the Americans. As reinforcements from Fort George continued to arrive, a party of Mohawk braves, allied with the British, made a guerrilla-style assault on the promontory, screaming war whoops as they fired potshots at the Yankees from concealment in the brush. Despite being completely bloodless, this firefight proved to be a devastating blow to the Americans, completely demoralizing the soldiers who had yet to cross the Niagara. In a remarkable repetition of the psychological warfare which won Brock and Tecumseh the siege of Detroit, the warriors' chilling battle cries echoed across the river, freezing the blood of the US militiamen who stood on the eastern shore. Defying the orders of their general, the Americans refused to enter the rowboats. Panic began to take hold of US troops just as reinforcements arrived from Fort George. Within hours, the British had regained complete control of Niagara's western shores, winning another unlikely victory against a much larger American force. The war plodded on after the Battle of Queenston Heights, the remainder of its first year being characterized by a third failed American invasion at Montreal and a succession of unexpected American naval victories on the high seas. In early 1813, British and Canadian militia moved into the forests of Michigan Territory and, alongside Tecumseh's braves, waged a ruthless campaign against the Americans. On April 27, 1813, 14 U.S. Navy warships, hastily constructed at Sackett's Harbor, New York, descended upon present-day Toronto, at that time the city of York. This capital of Upper Canada was located on the northwestern shores of Lake Ontario, about 30 miles or 48 kilometers northwest of Newark. A landing force of 1,700 American Army regulars quickly overwhelmed the city's 600-man garrison. During the retreat, the Redcoats detonated Fort York's powder magazine, killing several dozen American soldiers and U.S. General Zebulon Pike. In retaliation, the Yankees burned much of the city to the ground. After reorganizing at Fort Niagara, the U.S. military base located across the Niagara River from Newark, the Americans launched an assault on Fort George on May 25, 1813. For 2 days, American warships anchored in the Niagara River unleashed a cannon bombardment on Fort George, mercilessly barraging its bastions with heated shot. While the smoke cleared on the morning of May 27th, 4,000 U.S. soldiers disembarked on the shores of Lake Ontario to the northwest. Using grape shot to overwhelm the British soldiers who charged them with bayonets on the beach, the Yankees marched on Fort George. Unable to withstand the assault, the Redcoat defenders beat a hasty retreat to Burlington Heights, at the westernmost end of Lake Ontario, allowing the Americans to capture the fort, now little more than a smoking ruin, with few casualties. The author of the aforementioned journal, found in the archives of the Olde Angel Inn, was one of the many American militiamen who occupied Newark following the Battle of Fort George. The following constitutes the excerpts published on the establishment's menu.
September 27th, 1813. After a day's march from Lewiston and a river crossing at Fort Niagara, our band of citizen soldiers arrived in Canada as an occupation force. We number 3,000 all ranks, the majority drafted for 6-month service with the New York Militia, under the command of Brigadier General George McClure. Truth be told, we are a ragtag army, led by an aged politician, beset by illness, and with little enthusiasm for Mr. Madison's war. We are here to relieve our regular troops for other duties, rumored to be a major campaign against Montreal. These brave fellows are true men-at-arms, and a stark contrast to our undisciplined company of shopkeepers and farmers. They are commanded by Colonel Winfield Scott, an enterprising and widely admired officer who led the amphibious assault to capture Fort George on May 27th and chase the British defenders back to Burlington Heights. We watch them embark with anxious minds and hopes for an expedient conclusion to this conflict. Fort George has been heavily damaged, a charred ring marking the old palisades surrounding the burned-out foundations of the main blockhouse and barracks. We are to live in tents behind hastily constructed earthwork redoubts. A shallow trench extends towards the town, providing limited protection for our patrols. Despite the peaceful scene presented by the town, we know we have stirred up a hornet's nest. October 3rd, 1813. Our greatest fear is the massacre of our troops by savage Indians. Last June, a party of Caughnawaga warriors attacked an advance patrol and taking 7 prisoners. Our dragoons arrived to disperse the raiders, but were unable to rescue our comrades. What terrible fate befell them, I fear to contemplate. Ours is a war of marching drills and unending tedium, punctuated by brief skirmishes and false alarms. The position of our advance pickets changes constantly, and on occasion our sentries have been pushed back to the perimeters of the town. It is a deadly game of hit and run played by roaming bands of mounted raiders. 2 enemy groups are well known to us: Captain Merritt's Provincial Dragoons and Fitzgibbon's Green Tigers, with the green-faced tunics of the 49th Regiment. I've heard townspeople call them the Bloody Boys, a name well earned. They communicate using cowbells, and I can only guess how many musket balls have been fired at wandering cows by our nervous sentries. There have been no major engagements since June 24th, when a 500-man detachment of our cavalry and infantry surrendered to a much smaller force of British regulars and Indians at Beaver Dam, some 15 miles from Fort George. We are now content to hold our line of pickets against the gathering storm. The task of policing the local inhabitants falls to the Canadian Volunteers, a group of 250 defectors led by Joseph Wilcox and Benajah Mallory. Although they provide us with a valuable service, even our commanding officers regard them as little more than a band of marauders. November 10th, 1813. What causes precipitate men into so fatal a folly? Sailors' rights and free trade. That was our war cry. But there is little evidence of England's tyranny here amongst the well-cultivated fields and neatly appointed dwellings. How uncomfortably like a civil war this conflict seems. Today, we were detailed to guard a group of local citizens. They are captured militia and parole violators to be interned at Fort Niagara. Dixon, McEwen, Lane, Ross, by their names, dress, speech of any other description. They could, under different circumstances, be my neighbors or acquaintances back home. The town's population of 400 consists almost entirely of women, children, and the aged, any able-bodied men having enlisted with the British forces. There is an uneasy accommodation between the townspeople and their overseers, providing some semblance of ordinary life. The harvest is in, and there is a barter trade. As citizen soldiers, we must provide for the upkeep of our clothing and equipment, a constant challenge due to the scarcity of supply and ready money. Frequent a tavern in town to trade for necessities, and to fortify my nerve with something stronger than our daily issue of small beer. Even under the most trying circumstances, men will seek out the common diversions of life. The harmonious coach house is situated on Market de Quare in the center of town and provides a comparatively safe haven during daylight hours. We are cautioned against visiting the tavern after dark due to possible enemy activity. The townspeople would also have us believe the inn is haunted. With our nerves already frayed, we prudently avoid the inn at night. December 11th, 1813. Our 6-month term of enlistment ended December 9th, and I joined the mass exodus and recrossed the Niagara River. Without reinforcements so long awaited, The occupation of Fort George was no longer tenable. The remaining garrison of 60 regulars of the 24th U.S. Infantry began a final withdrawal yesterday as a last infamous chapter of this invasion played out. As night fell, we watched the far shore erupt in flames. The town was ablaze. What a terrible inferno. One could only wonder what form of retribution will follow. We have learned that General McClure, in a desperate moment, hoping to deny resources to the advancing British, ordered the town to be burned. The Canadian volunteers quickly put that order into effect, herding the inhabitants into the streets and torching the houses, courthouse, and public buildings. Any sign of respect paid to Wilcox and his band of traitors, for he is a traitor who cruelly betrays his neighbors for reasons of personal spite, was dearly misplaced. I am now my own man, having completed my term of service. I want to believe that there are like-minded people on both sides of the border who believe this war is utter folly. What hardship and unnecessary grief! This tragedy, like all others, can be cured only by time.